On the Q&A, and I guess I want to start off by asking Craig to talk a couple minutes about the organization. To give the, I mean, obviously, for a lot of the audience, the question is what can be done, and I want you to talk a little bit about what your organization is doing. Why did you found it, and what is it doing?
Sure. So,
it's on.
Is it?
Yeah.
You guys? Yeah. So I'll actually say I co-founded it, and I actually my undergraduate was in international relations and global affairs. I approached this from the international perspective, from a justice perspective, and I actually entered the climate movement with the intention of only being involved for 2 to 3 years. And the inconvenient truth got me on board. I thought I could jump on board, help push the political bandwagon in the right direction, and then I could go back to other things I was working on. And I've realized that it's going to be a much longer struggle than I anticipated. But I basically co-founded the organization just because I recognize there are students all across the state who are working on individual campus initiatives, which I think are absolutely essential, and a lot of universities have really been leading on this. I think a lot of it has been because of student involvement, though a lot of administrators and faculty have also sincerely led on campus greening. But looking at past social movements, I recognize that students have tended to be a pretty important role, or play a pretty important role in social movements, and that this one should be different. And so myself and just a couple of students from other universities around the state, I was the only graduate student, I believe, at the time, decided to found this network to basically try to aggregate that student power and to have us work on issues bigger than our own individual campuses while still doing some campus level work. And we actually initially lobbied, the first thing we did was to support the Global Warming Solutions Act. So as much as I criticized it, I did see it as a positive piece of legislation that I was proud to support. And I'm still thankful it's there. I think it's been driving some good changes, but again, just not as aggressive as we need. And I think that it's particularly the role of students and youth and young people who are going to inherit this future to really push the boundaries of what's politically feasible and to do as much as we can to advance the political dialogue. So after that bill got passed that same summer in 2008, Al Gore put out a call for 100% clean electricity in 10 years, which I was personally very inspired by. It was the first time I felt that I had heard a call to action that was equal to the scale of catastrophe we were looking at. And so we started rallying ourselves behind that goal. That was, again, summer 2008. In the spring of 2009, through our efforts, we got the state legislature to pass a resolution calling on Congress to get us 100% clean electricity in the next 10 years, which at that point was 2019. This past fall, we organized a widespread civil disobedience tactic that we nicknamed the Sleep Out, where we basically had people protesting the use of dirty electricity that powered their homes, dorms, and apartments, and we had over the period of 7 weeks leading up to the international negotiations in Copenhagen, Denmark last December, we had over 200 people illegally sleep out on the Boston Common, including Bill McKibben and the NASA scientist James Hansen that I mentioned. And over 200 of us got called to court. There were others who did sleep out but left when the police showed up. And we also had a number of sleepouts on campuses around the state, including here at Northeastern. Actually spent, I think, one night here with our student leaders. Yep. But that was very much just to show how seriously we took the problem and that we were willing to make some personal sacrifices, both to sleep in the cold at nights. There were, some nights it was raining heavily in the cold and there was snow on the ground and so on. But also just to show that, I think that there's much more we could have done and should have done, but we tried to make a good stand. We got over 25, 30 legislators either signed on to a letter to the governor asking us to introduce our bill or co-sponsored a bill that would create an emergency task force to evaluate how Massachusetts could get 100% clean electricity by 2020, which again lines up with that goal of trying to get off, the whole country off of coal by 2020. The notion was that if we expect states like West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania that are so heavily dependent on coal to transform their entire economies in the next decade, or maybe the next 15 years if we're going to be generous, to meet this 2030 deadline, then Massachusetts can't just replace the 25% of our electricity that comes from coal and call it a day. If we really want to lead, we need to similarly transform our entire electricity grid the way that we would need West Virginia, Ohio, and so on to do. So that was the scientific basis for our actions. we obviously did not succeed in getting that done before Copenhagen. So right now we are refocusing on coal as the biggest immediate threat in trying to get the state to shut down the 4 coal plants we have. And I've been talking for enough, but so we're a number of different actions around that.
Great. Let's open up for questions. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Why don't you pass this?
Thank you. Martin Evans. These efforts that you're putting in are all very good, but what success do you think they'll have compared with the gazillions of corporate funding that is fighting on the other side?
I think one of the most heartening things, we try to find some little bit of hope in the doom and gloom we're talking about, was the defeat of Proposition 23 in California. And there was an enormous amount, I don't know the final figure, but the people of California realized that this was really important to jobs and to the goal of reducing climate change. I think Massachusetts is the same. Another very important change that I see in terms of countering that is, if you remember about 10 months ago, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out with this position that they questioned climate change. And as a result, Apple dropped out, Nike dropped out of their board, and the head of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce is forming an organization of chambers throughout the country that aren't affiliated with the U.S. Chamber, don't support this position, and are really making a business case that we need climate change legislation, we need a tax on carbon, and we need to do that for our economy. So I see that as a positive counter that may move us in that direction.
And that's very exciting. I didn't know about that last part. I'm heartened by it. I think one crucial thing I would say is that, as you identified, there's so much money on it. I mean, it's something like 7 out of the top 10 wealthiest corporations in the world, the last time I looked, were energy companies. It's just not a pretty area for us. Walmart is actually on that list, and they've actually been doing some pretty serious greening, but the other 2 I don't think were particularly friendly. And I think the thing is that we're not going to ever successfully out-lobby or outspend these interests. The environmental community in the lead up to Copenhagen, and with this new Democratic majority, with Obama in office, doubled their lobbying expenditures. They basically went full steam ahead with everything they had and poured it into hired more lobbyists and more staff, and just spent like crazy lobbying. And the fossil fuel industry outspent them something like 7 or 8 to 1. And they obviously had a lot more to come from, ExxonMobil made something like $10 billion that year. And if they really felt like their interests were threatened, that's a big pile of money they could dip into to lobby. So I think we're never going to out-lobby them. We're never going to have enough people come in with nicely polished reports and say, well, here are the facts, and here's why we need to do this. And it's just not. It's not going to work. We need a movement, is the honest answer. I think that's the only way we're going to really change this economic system that we're addicted to. The same way that we abolished slavery was not through legislation. We had abolitionists, and we need new abolitionists to abolish fossil fuels.
Dave Holbrook, as we bring more wind and solar online, what's the state of the technology for storage? Or don't you need storage? You just need to trade grid and move it around.
The question's on storage capacity.
Right. I mean, you hit the nail on the head that is a very important point. There are some potential breakthroughs going on right here at MIT. And then the other side of that, of course, is investment in the grid and getting it there without storage. So there's 2 separate variables there: storage and the grid improvement. The stimulus does make some investment in renewing the grid, improving the grid, but like everything else, we're not making significant investments to really change the grid in the way we need to.
Stephen Chu spoke at MIT maybe about a year ago, and I was hard to hear it. He said that he thought we might have breakthrough in the next 5 years on the type of battery technology. I think he was saying that there are 5 different things that batteries need to do. I don't remember all of them, but in terms of like size and storage capacity and the period over which they retain their charge and some other things. And that, we have batteries that can do any one of those 5 things, and maybe 2 of them, but we don't yet have a battery that can do all 5. And I think it's just pouring the money into it to get us where we need to go. But you also identified, and Joan pointed out, the smart grid, which I think is incredibly exciting, and I think another area where much more investment is needed. Britain, from my understanding, has a policy of trying to have, I think, all of their homes be smart homes, or to have smart meters attached to their homes by 2020, which basically means that we can have direct communication from your house to the utility. Right now, if you notice, if your power goes out, the only way the utility knows that is if people start calling and saying, when is my power coming back? Which is kind of absurd if you think about the telecommunications era that we live on. And literally, you can talk to someone in Japan, but your utility company doesn't know if your power's out. It's just absurd that we haven't bothered upgrading our technology. And that technology is definitely within reach, and companies like Cisco Systems and Microsoft and Apple are really getting into smart appliances and smart homes, and having a device about this size that let you control all of the appliances in your house and have pre-programmed settings that say, when the price of electricity goes above X, I want you to slow down my washing machine, I want you to turn off my dishwasher, and when it goes below Y, I want you to charge my electric car, run my dishwasher, run my washing machine, do all the non-essential things, so we can have more fluctuation in our grid and have our demand follow our supply. Right now, our supply is incredibly, our supply is tied to our demand. If people demand this much, supply better be this much, or there's a crash. And there's no way for us to really adjust that line, except for some really big users that the utilities can communicate with. But I think that's a very exciting avenue for us to expand into.
I'm Alex Weinstein. I'm wondering, so the first speaker presented a somewhat more optimistic picture of what at least cities and states have done on these issues. I'm wondering what both of you think the tipping points will be for action and political viability for environment issues on the federal scale.
Jim was optimistic because there are a lot of really exciting things that Boston is doing in many other cities. And I think the point that we're making is, if you look at how many of those initiatives he talked about relied on federal funding. So it's the federal money coming into cities on energy efficiency. And there's just layers of policy that are needed. So adopting a stretch code is great. It's what Boston can do. But in terms of adopting renewable energy, which they have several initiatives, it relies on the state having the policies in place that I talked about. But ultimately, it's a policy chain. And unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. I can't imagine a scenario in the next 2 years in which there will be a climate bill or there will be an energy bill. So cities can still do the transit-oriented development, but there again, development of rail and so forth depends on federal money. You can do land use planning, but ultimately they're going to reach barriers to even the kind of things that he was talking about.
I would agree. I think that there are a lot of really great things going on, and I think we're going to see growth. I mean, it's going to start off smaller, and it's getting bigger and bigger as we go. In terms of tipping points, I think I completely agree. The next 2 years are shot federally, but the last 2 years were shot federally for conservatives, for Republicans, for the Tea Party, and they didn't whine about it. They went and built a movement, and they kicked the Dems out, and now they've got virtually control of Congress. We could do the same thing. It's completely within our power to do so if folks like you decide that you're fed up with what they're trying to do and take a stand and start rallying your friends. And I think, again, we need a more simple message. I would say, in all seriousness, that we need to stop burning fossil fuels. To make that a very simple thing, we can talk about the public health effects of burning fossil fuels. Tens of thousands of Americans die every year. We talk about national security implications of giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela. These are countries that are not particularly friendly or have our best interests in mind. And we can talk about the environmental justice implications of burning fossil fuels, where most of those facilities are located in disproportionately low-income communities and communities of color. And we can talk about climate change. And yes, it's very real, it's very much happening, and anyone who says otherwise needs to do some more homework. But in terms of other tipping points aside from a movement, I think the thing that that actually perversely gives me hope is what actually happened this summer in Pakistan and in Russia. If you believe the science, which I do believe, we're going to see worse natural disasters coming our way. Maybe a year from now, maybe 3 years from now, maybe 5 years from now. But we're going to see more Hurricane Katrinas. Some of them might, instead of hitting New Orleans or Florida, might hit DC or Boston, New York. We might see a massive heat wave that entirely wipes out Iowa's corn crop one summer. That kind of stuff can very quickly change what Americans understand about climate change and how real it appears to them. I think we saw that in Russia this summer when that heat wave hit. Russia had thought that climate change would be benign, if not beneficial to them. They thought that Siberia would become the breadbasket of the world, and they have ice-free ship lanes open in the Arctic, for year-round shipping. And then all of a sudden, Moscow is 100+ degrees. The forests were burning. Their grain crops were getting wiped out, and they realized this is real. This is a problem. We need to address it. We could see a very similar thing happen here. The question is, will that happen soon enough?
Yes, Margaret Dyson. I thought that the photograph of evergreen solar is a fascinating illustration of a challenge that the environmental community, the environmental movement, broadly speaking, is facing, which is that tension between the newest understandings of environmentalism and more traditional ones. You're looking at new construction, new roads, new impervious surface next to a wetland. When you look at that facility, and in the same way, when you start looking at the manufacturing issues related to compact fluorescents or batteries, there are going to be tensions within an understanding of environmentalism between clean energy and land use, for example. And not to put it too bluntly, but what gets thrown under the bus.
Well, you're right, and we're already seeing those tensions. So, for example, there's a proposal to put a huge photovoltaic farm in the Mojave Desert. Environmentalists are very much opposed to that, saying, well, okay, you're talking about covering 1/3 of the desert with solar panels. What are the environmental impacts of that? And we shouldn't throw away all the gains we've made with environmentalism and the environmental movement for the sake of energy. Similarly, where we're producing the energy, wind and solar, is not where the people are, so it's going to require transmission lines. Environmentalists are very much against the transmission lines. And typically, we're talking about 10 years before anything could be developed. So in terms of what you've laid out, in terms of a sense of urgency and timing, it's, even under the best of cases, so say we said, all right, we're going to fund the transmission lines, we're going to fund the large-scale energy farms, we're talking a long time before these environmental issues are resolved. So in many ways, when I'm looking at China is doing in high-speed rail, in all of this, well, we see when you don't have democracy, things can happen a lot more quickly. Not that we would want that, but there are fundamental contradictions in terms of environment.
Just one quick point off that. We do see, though, that if you've got enough money in our democracy, you can get those exemptions. The natural gas pipelines in our country completely waive out all those requirements for local zoning. They just get to go where they want. And I think, again, if we had the political will, we could very easily say, okay, transmission lines get the same priority, but it's entirely absent at present.
My name is Ann Tate, and a former member of the Office for Commonwealth Development. To the point you just made, I think that's what a state of emergency is for. We need for a state of emergency for national rail. But my question was focused on the advice to the governor and things that can happen at the state, and your idea of we need a movement. And I would submit that this advice to the government should include support, very strong support for a gas tax.
Yeah, I do agree with the gas tax. I think the cap and dividend would incorporate both gasoline as well as other. fossil fuels. I think the challenge with the gas tax is, if you look at electricity consumption, there is a correlation between your electricity consumption and your income, where people with less income consume less electricity. And so if you're giving money back on the per capita basis, you get more money back if you're lower income. That I think 60% of Americans would get more money back than they would see in higher electricity prices. People who live in a small house and don't have a big plasma TV and don't have a washer and dryer and all this stuff, they use a lot less electricity than someone who lives in a really big house. They have to heat and air condition, and that they've got the big plasma TVs and they're watching TVs in different rooms and playing video games and all this stuff is happening all the time. That's not as true with gasoline. That some people who are poor have to drive a lot farther from work because they can't afford to live closer. So I think while I do support a gas tax, I'm a little more hesitant to make that be a very aggressive thing, because that does have disproportionate burdens on lower income populations, whereas I think...
Doesn't that just mean that we need to design it better? I mean, you're talking about the system of
we absolutely
basically rebating, and if I would advise the governor to implement it in stages with a study that would say, we're going to try this over 2 years, and we're going to go up a penny a month, and we're going to monitor sample communities or whatever it is that it takes to figure out who is being hit disproportionately, if in fact they are. I think that the studies I've seen say it amounts to about a cup of coffee a week for most households, and if you knock out Starbucks, you could probably get 2 weeks. But I think that it needs to be studied, but that argument has taken it off the table time and again, and I don't believe that's actually effective advocacy, and I think we need to support, the governor was looking at this, and I think there needs to be a groundswell of support for the idea that we're willing to look at this and to tolerate its initial consequences and figure out how to adjust it for people who are unfairly penalized.
Joan, you want to do that? Or any additional questions? Yes, ma'am.
You spoke of electricity generation and the conflict between environmental considerations in the Hobby Desert or for transmission lines, and it seems to me that the
Can you
thing
speak
that
into the mic? You just hold the mic to your mouth right here.
okay. It seems to me the thing that's been missing from a lot of our conversation about electricity generation is stepping back from the problem, and I mean, all of the discussion seems to assume that we need to find a new kind of utility scale generation rather than looking more at distributed generation that doesn't require shipping or transmitting electricity over vast distances where you lose a great deal of it, and where you could minimize some of the effects of, you're still going to need utility scale generation for large scale users, but it seems to me that